are the rain-soaked forests of southern Chile. There are trees here which were saplings at the dawn of the Iron Age. The pilot of this plane is an eco-philanthropist who's using his personal fortune to buy up wilderness areas. Eco-philanthropists have lost faith in governments to fulfill their international conservation commitments. But some local people accuse him of practicing a new kind of colonialism, claiming that he's simply a wealthy man taking advantage of a poorer nation to buy up cheap land. In this week's Earth Report, we will examine these claims and tell the story of Pumalin Park, the largest privately owned nature reserve in the world. In the far south of Chile, around the 40th parallel, 1/3 of the world's last temperate rainforests still survive. This land is home to pumas and hummingbirds, and in the narrow fjords, seals, dolphins, and wild salmon swim in the icy waters, peppermint-coloured because they're fed by glaciers. Native forest cover has been reduced by almost 50% since the arrival of the first Europeans. As in the rest of Latin America, this process has accelerated rapidly over the past 30 years. But in the province of Palena, an American millionaire, Douglas Tompkins, has been buying up forest, over 300,000 hectares of it, and he and his wife, Kris, have almost completed the creation of their nature reserve.
If you look back the last, say, 35 years, maybe 40 years, the sort of dawn of the modern environmental movement, nobody really acknowledged that it was an environmental crisis. That took about 15 or 20 years, and then suddenly the collective consciousness arrived at the understanding there was a crisis. There was no longer the denial. Most everybody agreed there was a crisis. Then the next 15 years was to say how, or determine in the collective consciousness how large the crisis was. And now we're at the point of arguing over what to do about it.
Douglas Tompkins first went to southern Chile as a young man with a passion for sport and nature.
He sold his business in San Francisco in the late 80s. And when he did, he was sort of casting about, wondering what he would do with the rest of his life. He'd been a conservationist for years, but never had taken it to the degree that would have made it his full-time passion and vocation. But a friend of ours told him about this area in southern Chile that really had large tracts of forests that had never been cut. They were absolutely prime forests. And so Doug came down here to look at really a place to live. And he discovered this extraordinary area and bought a farm. And then out of that began the idea of buying more property as it became available and really beginning to protect these forests.
Less than half of our planet's forests are still pristine. Where they grow in tracts of 5,000 hectares or more, they qualify as frontier forests, and only 3% of these grow in the cooler climes of temperate zones such as Chile or Tasmania. The greatest losses of Chile's native forests have occurred in the central southern region. A study in this area by the forestry corporation CONAF showed that 25,000 hectares were lost in just 4 years. Over half was converted into tree plantations. But the forestry corporation seems reluctant to acknowledge its own figures.
Thanks to conservation measures in Chile, there has been no substantial loss of native forests, although it is true to say that there has been an increase in forestry with plantations of exotic species. But this has not caused the loss of native forests. There has been a substitution of forests for plantation in zones of scrubland where there is no possible economic benefits to be had.
The economic benefits of Latin America's natural resources have been fully exploited since the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, and timber has been one of the great prizes. When the first German settlers reached Lake Yanquihue by ox cart in 1852 and founded Puerto Varas, they set about felling all the ancient Alerce forests along the valley between the coast and the lakes. The Alerce is a conifer that can live to 3,500 years old and is virtually indestructible. The settlers used its wood to build just about everything they needed, and at one time, the traditional tiles were even used as currency. The Alerce was, in fact, the basis of the local economy, and the wooden houses of Puerto Varas or in Puerto Montt on the coast bear witness to the legacy of the great forests which once grew here and the wealth they created for the early inhabitants. When General Pinochet seized power in the coup of 1973, his regime enthusiastically adopted free market policies, and state-owned forests were privatized, and forestry firms were offered tax breaks and handsome subsidies, 75% of the costs, to replace native forests with tree plantations. Conservation was definitely not on the agenda. These subsidies and tax exemptions have remained in place ever since, and forestry products now represent 10% of Chilean exports. Deforestation has particularly affected the Mapuche people. Their ancestral lands have been transformed in just 2 generations.
To find out what these fields, this landscape used to be like, I had to ask my grandfather, my neighbors and my uncles. What I got out of them was that 20, 40 years ago, this was all forest. And today, there's hardly anything left of the native forest. I remember a place I knew 20 years ago. Such a lovely mountain it was, such lovely running water, and suddenly, 20 years later, I go back to look and I can't find a thing. No woods, no water, no nothing. And that really hurt me.
Where the ancient forests have been clear-cut, plantations of pine and eucalyptus replace them. After 15 to 20 years, these are harvested and exported, some of them in the form of wood chips, which go mainly to Japan for making fax and wrapping paper. The chip mountain in the harbour of Puerto Montt is a reminder of Chile's generosity with its natural resources. People have only recently begun to listen to critics of the Chilean miracle when they point to its huge environmental cost. Less than 30% of Chile's frontier forests are officially protected, so the value of private nature reserves such as Pumalin is starting to be appreciated.
Well, Neruda said, if you haven't seen the Chilean forests, you haven't seen the planet. And what's important about these forests is that they're some of the last places where you can find temperate rainforests. It's pretty important for our planet and for humanity to save an area like this.
Pumalin Park is huge, about the size of California's Yosemite National Park. Most of its tiny centres and model camping sites can only be reached by boat, but despite its inaccessibility, the park has received about 50,000 visitors over the years who find its beauty spellbinding.
Little by little, Pumalin Park began to take shape in his own mind, so we have come what's now the last 9 years of really buying most of the property that we'll have for this particular park, and then concentrating for many years on the infrastructure, the trails, the hotel, the restaurants.
Since selling out his share of the successful Esprit clothing empire in the late 80s, Tompkins has been using his fortune to promote the ideals of his Deep Ecology Foundation in San Francisco. The first piece of land he helped to buy was a remnant of the Araucaria or monkey puzzle forest, trees that were around at the time of the dinosaurs. Then, in 1992, Tompkins and his wife Kris founded the Conservation Land Trust, which for the past decade has been buying up tracts of wilderness in Chile and Argentina. But Pumalin Park and its millionaire owner have provoked some ferocious criticism.
No hemos aceptado la compra de parte de un inversor.
We haven't accepted the purchase of land by a foreign investor because it's had a strong economic impact on my village, and it's meant a slowing down of development.
Genera un entorpecimiento a lo que es el desarrollo.
Well, I don't know if those who really oppose us are ready to accept us, because they're fundamentally so pro-development that they can't understand conservation. And of course, in an area where people are not conservation-minded, where there's development fever running from the government to the entrepreneurial class, you better be realistic and realize that there's going to be a lot of opposition to these kinds of projects. That's the way it is, and you'd be naive to think it was otherwise.
More serious charges concern claims that Tompkins forcefully evicted local settlers, many of indigenous origin.
Bueno, los problemas que ha traído la presencia de Douglas Tompkins en la zona.
What problems has Douglas Tompkins brought here? Firstly, with the people who live here, people who were expropriated. Their land was bought for next to nothing. People were pressured, people who had lived here for many years and who were paid a pittance for their land. Really, the question is the other way around. What good have Douglas Tompkins and his so-called investments done here for us?
Other locals disagree.
No creo.
No, I don't think so. Of course, that's what people said. But if you ask me, I don't believe it. And you know why? Because if I want to sell my land and someone wants to buy it, then I sell. And if I don't want to sell, I just don't. And that's what happened here with Don Doug. He didn't pressure anybody.
On this question of pressure on local people, it really depends who you talk to. What is visible is the regeneration of small local farms, though indigenous farmers seem underrepresented.
If you're going to be a serious ecologist, you can't leave the social human aspects behind, because you won't get anywhere. On any project, you have to at least take into consideration the social community aspects of your project.
Another part of the project is the Produce Marketing and Honey Production Center.
Pumalin Park's main objective is conservation. Honey production is a way of using a forest resource without having to fell the trees.
The organic produce grown on the farms is sold locally and consumed in the park's restaurant. Since the park runs from the ocean on the one side to the Argentinian border on the other, following the border for 65 kilometers, in places, Pumalin Park literally cuts Chile in two. When a further large piece of land running through the middle of Pumalin Park became available in 1997, all the stops were pulled out to prevent the American millionaire from buying it. Eventually, this land was purchased by Endesa, the Spanish-Chilean energy giant who've set up a foundation for environmental research here, a new departure for an energy corporation. We asked the director how Endesa had come to buy the area.
Y cuando el Parque Pumalin estaba
Pumalin Park continued to grow, when the Catholic University of Valparaiso, which owned this land, wanted to sell it, a number of possibilities were examined. One was that it could be sold to Doug Tompkins, but there were interests which were keen to avoid this. Finally, Endesa bought the land in 1998 and set up the Hualaihue Foundation, together with the Catholic University of Valparaiso.
The problem with big corporations like that is that they did this. They bought that land as a political favor for the Frey government, and not because it was something that they wanted to do. That's what the problem is. It was done for the wrong reasons. But what I think will happen, eventually when Pumalin gets donated to the national park systems of Chile, it would be sensible that they would donate their piece too and unite it into one big piece and make a national park out of it. So I have faith in the future wisdom of their executives.
Pumalin had a lot of detractors in its early days, but I would say there are less and less of them nowadays, because we've opened up our doors and shown what the project is really about. In fact, nearly all of our people are local, and we always give preference to them for labor and training schemes so that we can leave our mark around here.
Another group who have no fondness for Tompkins and his nature reserve are the businesses engaged in salmon farming, a boom industry in this part of the world.
He's created all sorts of conflicts with local fishermen and especially with the salmon farming industry. In my community, this is important economically and obviously also for absorbing local labor.
From Scotland to Nova Scotia, salmon farming in offshore cages like this is causing great concern to marine ecologists. Fish feed and chemicals can contaminate the seabed. Escaped salmon are spreading diseases to their wild cousins. Chile is lagging far behind the Northern Hemisphere in imposing controls.
What's been happening, for example here in this small fjord behind us, is that they're overloading it and trying to obtain more production of salmon meat than the area allows. That's what's been happening here. So this fjord is producing, say, 500 kilograms of salmon, when it should really only produce 100 kilograms. And this is what the salmon farmers themselves have to determine, and that way they'll reduce the amount of sickness and especially the mortality rate of the fish.
Well, I think that the war between development and conservation is a big one and only getting heated up more so as resources, the world's resources, are more scarce every year. Until our governments, well, really starting with ourselves, our families, our communities, our states, then our countries, then the UN, whatever it is, until we agree that there are limits to everything. When we take and look at the globalization, the global economy, the monoculturalization of the planet, these are people who think there are no limits.
I think we're arriving at the first serious critiques now of capitalism, which is fundamentally the engine that is driving this crisis. It's driving not just the environmental crisis, but the crisis of culture and the crisis of society. Certainly, unfettered capitalism as we have it now is driving the world off the abyss.
Although Pumalin Park is privately owned, and mainly to ensure conservation, tourism of a thoughtful kind is encouraged, and Tompkins subcontracts the adventurous activities to men like Gerardo Niklitschek.
Well, I think the importance of this place, of coming here with people, letting them enjoy it, apart from the fact that it's what I do for a living, it's all about raising awareness. And it's not me that does it, it's nature that does it.
Lo que me dedico, creo que es muy importante sensibilizar. Y no lo hago yo, lo hace la naturaleza.
Tourism is growing in Chile, and even the most enthusiastic free marketeers are beginning to realize that there might be more money to be made by keeping the relics of Chile's old-growth forests.
¿Cuál es la gran riqueza que tiene el Chile austral? Su naturaleza.
What is our wealth here in Chile's far south? Nature. Tourism is going to be one of the mainstays for the development of our local communities and in the whole of the far south. But that's why we want it to be allowed inside these lands. We don't want to get left out of making money, out of this deal.
To have places like this which are absolutely, natural beauty is very important. And it's important that it's preserved. So there has to be some sort of control over companies to stop them sort of developing everywhere. And there is, hopefully this sort of tourism, becomes increasingly popular. And then there's an economic benefit to the country as well and to the individuals like Gerardo working here.
Pumalin is a showcase park where each new area is carefully restored and renovated, and money is no object. Tompkins' hand is everywhere. There's even a shade of paint called Tompkins Green, which matches the forests. So, is Pumalin a rich man's whim, or a key development in the internationally agreed target of reserving 1/10 of the world's land surfaces for protection? As the critics fall away, Tompkins seems to be viewed these days as an increasingly enlightened monarch. He's pledged to hand Pumalin over through a Chilean foundation to the national parks system once he's completed the project. With its tourist facilities, shops and land restoration, Pumalin Park and its subsidiary companies are now the largest employers in the province. So, is buying up wildernesses the right way to achieve the conservation of our biodiversity?
First of all, we believe in, if we could, in a perfect world, we would hope that all conservation efforts are public conservation efforts. That would be wonderful. But that's not the case today. And so we think, then take it into your own hands to the extent that anybody can, whether it's 4 acres or 4 million acres is really not the point. The point is, I think, that we have to participate and share the responsibility for protecting wild nature to the extent that anyone can. And where it's appropriate, it's nice that those lands are made with some public access, though I don't necessarily believe that humans are supposed to be everywhere. I'm happy that in most parks, and certainly it's the case here, you have probably 5% of the actual area is accessible, and then the other 95% is just completely free to let wild nature develop and evolve as it would being left alone.
As far as we're concerned, when Mr. Tompkins or any other foreigner buys up large areas of land in our territory, it's because there's some business deal involved. Yesterday it was copper or oil. Today the biggest money maker is environmental conservation.
Conservation doesn't work anywhere unless you have a lot of people who love the place that they're working on. It just doesn't happen. It's as simple as that. Yeah, love and commitment. It's like getting married.